So, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this timely discussion, Cyprus at a Crossroads, the geopolitical case for a two-state solution. I am Eren Ramadan, the founder and chairman of the Young Turkish Cypriots group, and tonight we're privileged to be joined by Professor Hasan Ünal, a leading academic in international relations, diplomacy, and geopolitical strategy. As many of you know, the Cyprus issue has remained unresolved for over 60 years. And for much of that time, the international community and UN sponsored talks have focused on a federal model, reuniting the island under one bicommunal, bizonal state. But today we stand at a turning point. The reality on the ground is that there are two functioning administrations, two peoples with distinct governance and identities, which has existed since 1964. In recent years, especially following the failure of the Crans-Montana talks in 2017 and the election of President Ersin Tatar in 2020, the two-state solution has come into clearer focus, not just as an ideal, but as a practical and just outcome. Over the next hour, we'll explore how this proposal fits within the political and historical reality of Cyprus, the shifting international climate, and what the future may look like for the Turkish Cypriot people. But before we dive in, I'd like to thank you again for attending, and I will now ask Professor Ünal to introduce himself before going on to the first question of the night. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eren. I'm attached to Başkent University here in Ankara. Many years ago, I did my PhD in Britain at Manchester University, though I lived mostly in London, working at the British Foreign Office Archives in PRO in Kew Gardens area. And then I came down to Turkey in Ankara. I'm basically an Ankara person, born and bred. I took up a job at Bilkent University until I got retired. Then I moved to several other universities. I have been working at I have worked at Gazi University, Atılım University, both in Ankara, and then Maltepe University in Istanbul. And about 2 years ago, I came back to Ankara, my hometown, and I have been with the Başkent University here. Basically, I teach political history, Turkish foreign policy, and I read and write about Turkish foreign policy mainly. I used to do quite a bit of research and publish, and also talk about the Turco-Greek dispute in general, and the Cyprus question in particular. I was quite close to, though I had no official position, but I was quite close to the late president, great statesman Denktaş in the Turkish Republic of Cyprus from 1995 to until his death, basically in 2012. I also cover other parts of Turkish foreign policy, Turkey's relations with Middle Eastern countries and Turkey's involvement in Syria, for instance, over the last a decade or so, of which I'm quite critical of the Turkish government's handling. And I also do cover lately Turco-Russian relations in a multipolar world order. So, and lately I have been working on on particularly multipolarity, and I think I will share some of my views about multipolarity as it basically pertains to the Cyprus question, or as far as it basically concerns the Cyprus question. That's that. In addition to my academic work at universities, teachings, I have several of my students have done very well in their careers. They have become quite famous academics, both in Turkey and outside Turkey, in the Balkan countries, in America, some of them, as well as quite a number of, quite a few of my former students have made careers in politics, including the present Turkish Foreign Minister, Hakan Fidan, whom I used to teach at Bilkent. So, though I'm not terribly happy with his performance as a minister, but this is what it is. So, you can imagine that I've been doing a lot of teaching. I've been basically training students here and there. My students have been doing well in their careers after graduation. Plus, I do quite a bit of journalism. Journalism in the sense that I contribute to both national and international media. Um, um, uh, you know, you can you name it, either an international media channel or something, you would find my name, either as a quotation or lately as appearance or something, both in the Western media as well as in Russian, Chinese, Iranian, and what have you. So that's what I am, and I'm very
Perfect.
happy that Eren has brought us together tonight, and we are going to have a good, actually, chat about the Cyprus question, about the fundamentals of the Cyprus question. Maybe I should say just, few things. I'm
Sure.
sure you know much of it, but just to refresh our memories about the Cyprus question. Basically, as far as I'm concerned, what when they ask me what is the basic basics of the Cyprus question, I just say, well, it's just a post-colonial question, a post-colonial problem. So you have a colonial power, um, which is Britain, and then you know Britain basically decides to leave the island in around 1956-7 after the Suez debacle, and under pressure from the Greeks in the island who want to basically unite who want to basically unite the island with what they consider motherland Greece, which had no official connection with the island as far as the international law was concerned at the time. But this is what they wanted to achieve. And you have the Turkish community scattered across the island at the time who opposed this. So, in other words, you have a Greek community, the majority, and the Turkish community. The Turkish community and the Greek community used to live under the colonial power, but once the colonial administration is gone or was about to, then the Turkish community says, well, I can't basically accept the Greek, how shall I say, sovereignty over me. So Britain was a different story. It was a different kettle of fish, as they say in Britain. But if the Greeks were to take over, I'd go my own way. That is, I would either join up with Turkey or I would have my own cantons, some sort of federal administration, or blah, blah. So, as the problem basically concerned two NATO members, so it became an inter-NATO question. And then you have all these clever diplomats all the time working to, bring something out of their hat. Oh, this is the latest, what about this formula and that formula and blah, blah formula. The first formulas and attempts brought about the Cyprus Republic of 1960, which the Greeks destroyed from 1963 onwards as they pushed the Turks out of their administration. Um, uh, uh, as the international treaties which established a Cyprus Republic was largely an agreement on the basis of power sharing. The Turks had their own share of the power. They had their own share of sovereignty. But as the Greeks resorted to violence, the Turks on their own could not necessarily face up to the majority Greeks, and this brought into the whole puzzle the motherland Turkey, which had all the right, in accordance with the international treaties which gave rise to the Republic of Cyprus, into the conflict. So, as the 11 years of ethnic cleansing by the Greek militia and by the so-called Cyprus government headed by Makarios brought about no solution to the problem, and particularly to the ordeal that the Turkish community was subjected to. And on top of all that, the Greeks basically carried out a coup on the 15th of July 1974. Turkey could not remain a passive onlooker. Instead, it immediately contacted Britain, which was also a guarantor state alongside Greece, one of the three guarantor states, which were responsible for the protection of internal administration of Cyprus, as well as the protection of the Republic of Cyprus against external, how shall I say, aggression. Now, this brought about a completely new situation. As we see today, Turkey intervened militarily. It was a hugely successful military intervention, and also quite rapid, in the sense that the Greeks basically carried out the coup on the 15th, and 5 days later, the Turkish soldiery was on the island. And the operation was carried out at two phases, at the end of which today's situation came about. The island was divided physically. The Greeks in the north were transported, or they basically went down to the south on the UN protected transportation, and the Turks made their trek into the north to find a place to live in. And since then, all these new diplomats and blah blah, come round to find a solution. Now, here I've got a few points to make. The first point is the Greeks have rejected all the international proposals put before the parties by the international community, either directly or by an intermediary like the United States or Britain, or after 1974, and particularly after the declaration of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus in 1983, by the UN Secretary Generals through their good offices mission. So you have, for instance, the former Greek foreign minister, Nikos Rolandis, who was the foreign minister of the Greek Cypriot administration in the south in the first half of 1980s, and who negotiated with the Turkish side a federation um, um, in the context of a proposal prepared by the UN Secretary General then, Perez de Cuellar, some sort of working federation um, on the basis of bizonality, bicommunality, and on the basis of political equality of the two communities, something along those lines. And then it was rejected by the Greeks. Keep in your mind the name Nikos Rolandis, because he's going to say, just before his death, some years back, that Greek Cypriot side rejected 17 international proposals put before them. And then the second package they rejected was prepared by Boutros Ghali, the Secretary General then, and the final one, the third package, was the Kofi Annan plan in 2004, as Aaron pointed out. Now, and in the meantime, several other proposals about CBMs, about this and the other, and after the basically collapse of the Annan plan, then President Mehmet Ali Talat, who was very enthusiastic about a federation with the Greeks and who always blamed President Denktash for the breakdown of the talks for federation. And he got into series of negotiations with the Greeks, and finally he gave up, saying that nothing, no federation could be ever achieved with the Greeks. And he said, what further concession could I make to achieve a federation? Or shall I just hang myself in the center of Turkish side of Nicosia? What do you want? He said, basically. I mean, even he got angry to that extent. And then the negotiations were taken up once again by the Turkish president Mustafa Akıncı, who was even more enthusiastic for a federation with the Greeks. But yeah, the good thing, or whether it was good or not, the other thing which is worthy of note is that the Turkish government in Ankara supported all these efforts by the Turkish Cypriot side to achieve a federation. But Mustafa Akıncı also gave up in 2017 after the talks in Crans-Montana in Switzerland broke down, saying that again, the Greeks don't want a federation. Now, this being the case, basically, the Turkish side, how shall I say, adopted a new policy that is two-state. In actual fact, presumably, this is, this was, or this should have been the Turkish position right from 1974, because now, on the one hand, we keep talking about the resolution of the Cyprus problem. And so many diplomats made their career out of this. So many experts also made their careers, wrote articles and books and what have you about that, and all talk about the Cyprus question that hasn't been resolved. And perhaps we are looking at it from a wrong angle. So perhaps the Cyprus question has been resolved. And because it is being resolved, it cannot be resolved further. So the resolution will have to be based on the facts on the ground. This is what it is in the end. And now the Greeks are, as usual, crying out everywhere and uh, weaning and, making themselves sometimes look foolish and saying, well, look, the Turks are basically getting their way all the time in Cyprus and this and that. Now, why we can't have a federation with the Greeks? First of all, ethnic federations is no good because they don't work. They don't work, they haven't worked anywhere. All the ethnic-based federations of socialist types, Yugoslavia, Soviet Union, all broke down. And Czechoslovakia, after it gave up communism, also broke down into two states. And even Spain could have basically become dismantled if the European Union hadn't involved to such a great extent to keep the separatist part of Spain within Spain, putting all the pressure. And there's no guarantee that Spain is going to remain one single entity. And there's no guarantee, although United Kingdom is not a federation, it's not a nation state, it has a sui generis, basically, state with its own special history and what have you. But even then, you have problems in the United Kingdom. At some stage, Scotland might get out, and even Northern Ireland might decide to join up with either Ireland, the state of Ireland, or get out of United Kingdom and become a small state on its own. You have all this. So what I'm saying here, even Belgium is practically divided. To all intents and purposes, it is not a single state at all. It is divided along ethnic lines, and the Flemish part and the Wallon part, and then the Brazilian, but the Brussels. You have quite a divided state. Now, the second thing is some of the federations that are working are nation states. Germany, it's a federation, but it's one single nation. It is just administratively federation, like the United States. It is one single nation. It is Americans. And, as Trump keeps saying, they want to make America great again. So ethnic federations don't work. Even Switzerland has become a nation state. Okay, it is federation in the sense of its administration. It's not like French nation and the German nation and blah blah nation, ethnic, communities coming together to form a federation. No, Switzerland is an old country. It was recognized internationally in 1648. Its its nationhood process is, older than France and certainly Germany. So it's got blended into one single nation state. But in terms of its administration, it's not unitary. It is federation. So basically, to bring about a federation along ethnic lines in Cyprus, a federation that would work, I think it's a dream. And the whole thing was about to push Turkey out of the island. They haven't managed that. We can go into that in the Q&A. But what I'm saying is, in the multipolar world order that has now emerged firmly, the Turkish Cypriot community, as well as Turkey, have much more chances, and their situation is now on rock solid ground to remain in Cyprus in whatever form. Whether the so-called international community recognizes Turkish Republic of Cyprus or not, and if the Western world basically keeps shunning the Turkish Republic of Cyprus, and others don't take an active interest, other solutions would come round we can talk about. I think
Yeah.
that's more than enough. We can move on to the questions, and I would be prepared to answer all your questions as far as I can, as much as I can.
Well, thank you, Professor. Now, I mean, my first question was going to be on why hasn't a federal solution worked in Cyprus, and why has the two-state solution model, why is that now more realistic to accept? But you've answered that perfectly. I mean, Greek Cypriot intransigence, the realities on the ground, the failure of ethnic federal states, for example. So I think we can pass on that question. But just going back to something you did touch on regarding the international community in the Western world, why do you think that the international community has been reluctant to recognize Northern Cyprus, despite some other cases of de facto states gaining recognition?
Well, I think much of the resolution of the Cyprus question revolved around how to get Turkey out of the island. You know, this was what the Western world or important actors, important international players, basically um, um, wreck their brains, if you like. Okay, so their focus was on that, how to get Turkey out. Now, why? Um, because, for instance, according to the Americans in the 1970s and 80s, Cyprus was like a big aircraft carrier, okay, and unsinkable, as they used to call it, unsinkable um, uh, aircraft carrier. Now, I remember talking to a number of American diplomats and others, both in Ankara and Washington, D.C., and saying, well, look, the British have bases down in the south, and why don't you recognize the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus? And then you also make an arrangement with the TRNC for the lease of a couple of military bases for the United States, an air base as well as a naval base. Well, this would put them right on the spot. Okay, yeah, why not? The answer would be like, well, you know, Professor, thank you for asking the question. Now I'm going to be frank with you, as the Americans normally talk. Well, I'm gonna be frank with you, okay? But it's off the record, of course. And look, we have all the bases and the facilities in Turkey that we use. And anything in Northern Cyprus would be a duplication, wasting your money. Okay. Um, well, but um, we think that if one day Turkey doesn't let us use its own facilities for what we do in the Middle East and across the region, then we would use Cyprus as a military basis against Turkey to contain Turkey. So we need a Cyprus, whatever form of solution, federation, power sharing agreement, Turks having blah blah percentage of bureaucrats in here and in the parliament and blah blah. It doesn't matter as long as there is no Turkish troops on the island. Okay? Now, well, that's not going to happen. Okay? I would just say, as in my time in Britain, it used to be quite fashionable a word, tough, you say. I'm sorry, but tough. You know, you can't get it. And they haven't got it. Okay? And now, in a multipolar world order, they're not going to get it. Plus, the weapons systems have changed. You can't use Cyprus as a military base to contain Turkey militarily. Turkey would bomb the whole island down, okay, through missiles and what have you. And we produce our own missiles, by the way. So you can't have that. Now, the question is, why don't you change your position then? Well, I think there's a saying, there's something which is internationally accepted in the jargon of international relations, that states are like big catamarans, They're not like small boats that can actually make all sorts of maneuver and navigate quite easily. It goes and goes, and then when it wants to make a maneuver, it takes quite a bit of time and a lot of effort and blah blah. So states don't change their mind immediately, but there may be some catalyst, like the multipolar world order. Okay, Turkey's position seems to have hit a setback with some of the with all the Central Asian Turkic republics opening embassies in the south. But at the same time, you have, for instance, other states that are saying they would be prepared to recognize Northern Cyprus if and when Turkey basically comes out and, how shall I say, request that of these countries. Or at some stage, for instance, during the initial stages of the war in Ukraine, even Russia, a permanent member of Security Council, was almost prepared to dole out recognition to the Turkish Republic of Cyprus. It could come again. And if the Greeks, by the way, militarize the island in the way they are trying to, then the whole island and the how shall I say, the very location of the island might become some sort of how shall I say, flashpoint, in a multipolar world order, and if it turns into a flashpoint, then the European Union countries, if they continue to support the Greeks, for instance, in 5 years' time, Trump might just sell them out at some stage. He might just say, I don't give a damn about the Greeks. He almost said that to Mitsotakis in his first presidency when he was weaning about the Turks and Turkey, that they were basically wandering around the Aegean and Cyprus in a trigger-happy way. And then he was indicating that war might be inevitable. And Trump said, I remember it, well, the Turks would beat you hollow, it would be a terrible defeat on your part, so be careful.
Yeah.
And so so things are changing.
Okay.
And changing to Turkey's favor, to Turkish Cypriot community's favor, and to the favor of the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus.
Okay. Well, there's 2 points I'd like to touch on there, two different questions. I mean, the first one is Donald Trump. I mean, with Donald Trump now returning to office, US foreign policy, perhaps on Cyprus, is expected to shift. I mean, we saw under Biden, the US deepened military ties with Greece and lifted the arms embargo on the Greek Cypriot side. But could Trump, I mean, he's been quite pro Erdogan out in public, but could Trump take a more Turkiye friendly approach? And what impact could this have on the Cyprus issue?
Well, I think it could, and it would have a very positive effect on the Cyprus question from the Turkish point of view. For instance, um, from the way Trump makes foreign policy assertions, if you like, one could gather that um, he doesn't give a damn about the rules-based order and all that thing, and not anymore. So this means he's in full grasp of the fact that multipolarity is unavoidable. You can't stop it. It's unstoppable. So he wants to make America great again under these circumstances instead of wasting US's resources everywhere in the world for things like democracy promotion, human rights promotion, and blah, blah. But all of these fly in the face of what the Israelis have been doing in Gaza. So any African, Eurasian, Turkish, Latin American, or other countries' leadership could easily say, well, you mean democracy a la Gaza? You mean human rights a la Gaza? Or what? What are you talking about? So he does seem to understand that those days are over. Now, for instance, I could say that it is within the bounds of possibility that Turkey could shake hands with the United States on the basis of two states in Cyprus, in return for Turkey giving up its anti-Israeli assertions. You see what I mean? Okay, so I mean there doesn't appear to be any national interest that is dividing Turkey and Israel. So Turkish-Israeli rapprochement is quite possible, and it's more than plausible. It could be done, and Trump could certainly help out with that. And once you get that, the rest is just formalities. For instance, you say to Trump, look, these silly Greeks, if using his jargon, this is the way he talks. Look at these silly Greeks. They don't want a solution. They have rejected all. And I don't know what they want. I don't also know what the European Union wants us to, because because Trump hates the European Union to their guts. He hates their guts. Okay, so because I think with justice, he thinks they are just chattering classes with no understanding of strategy, no understanding of real economy, finance, and what have you. I think Trump is absolutely right. Even the present British government, you have, for instance, say Nigel Farage as prime minister. So you can also talk to Nigel Farage and say, look, um, why don't you recognize Northern Cyprus? Because Turkey is a major country, Britain is a major country on both sides of on the either side of Europe. trading nations. We have absolutely good relations and all that. Why do you basically um, give in to to their whims? So it could easily turn into a bargain. So you can say, well, if NATO is something that is important, that is dear to you, then okay, you have Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, you have the Greek state in the south, both could become members of NATO. Okay, so the island would be a NATO island if this is what you want. But Trump doesn't give a damn about NATO either. So my how shall I say prediction is that because of this Greek how shall I say vanity and the Greek procrastination, we'll have a situation in about 5-10 years, multipolarity having entrenched, having become totally entrenched across the board, and no European Union, what they call the extreme right parties in power in Germany, France, and what have you. Maybe there no European Union, certainly not in the proper sense of the word. And then we are, I think, going to turn to the Greeks and say, okay, where did we leave off? Do you remember?
Yeah.
And then they are going to be begging for a solution along the Turkish arguments, both in Cyprus and the Aegean. So there is no point in pushing this. I think it's much of it is psychological. And psychologically imbued foreign policy problems cannot be resolved easily. So
Yeah.
one point, they say, for instance, those who promote NATO, they say, well, NATO destroyed the Soviet Union. Yes, it certainly contributed to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, not destroyed it. And secondly, they say it prevented a Turco-Greek war, which is also true to a large extent. But I say to them, yes, but there is a big but. And that but means that NATO actually made the Turco-Greek dispute almost unresolvable because NATO tried to empower the Greeks as opposed to the powerful Turkey. And then you have a situation where there is how shall I say, Greece, which is totally, which is, which is out for, you know, for a zero sum option, nothing other than zero sum, and it cannot have it. So this is because of NATO. Without NATO, for instance, and without a bipolar world order, think about it, there would have been a war between Greece and Turkey, and all the problems would have been resolved. And we are, I think, going to come to that situation soon in a multipolar world order, but
Yeah.
without a war this time, of course.
Okay. Well, thank you for that answer once again. Now you brought up the European Union a few times, and there's about three or four questions in the Q&A regarding the EU and what's just happened in Central Asia. So, as you obviously know, in recent months we've seen a 12 billion EU investment package aimed at deepening ties with Central Asia, and at the same time, several Turkic states, including Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan have opened embassies in the south. Do you think this is part of a broader European strategy to weaken the influence of the Organization of Turkic States? Is it there to drive a wedge between Northern Cyprus and its natural allies in Central Asia? What are your thoughts on this recent development?
Well, it certainly is, and European Union has been working for that for the last nearly a year and a half. Um, uh, so I'm, for instance, critical of Turkish foreign ministry's handling of the situation, because they have been focusing on Gaza, Israel, and all that. And I think they have sort of, um, um, you know, they must have been out of touch with what was going on in Central Asia. And Turkey's policy in Syria, in particular, may have hurt Russia's sensibilities, although Russia officially hasn't complained about anything about Turkey, about what Turkey did, um, uh, bringing down the Assad government and all that, because Turkey and Russia have a lot, uh, in common, both economically, trade-wise, and the two countries do cooperate and do consult with each other over a variety of political issues in the region. Turkey's middle way policy in the Ukraine war has been very helpful to Russia, and the Russian government, as well as the Russian general public, appreciate that tremendously. But there are also problems. So Turkey may have gone a little off the, how shall I say, off the red line in Syria. So there may be Moscow's hand in the Central Asian countries' recognition. Well, not recognition, but opening embassies in southern Cyprus. Um, and or Moscow may have heard about it, but did not say anything against. Okay, did not warn them, don't do it because Turkey is our friend and ally in our struggle against the West and blah blah. But the Central Asian countries may have been concerned about Turkish, about the perception of Turkey outside Turkey. That is, um, in the eyes of the in the eyes of the quite many countries, including the West, the Turkish government seems to be is viewed as a is viewed a government that is um, too keen to support jihadist movements, okay, particularly in Syria. And when it comes to jihadism, Central Asian Turkic countries are very, very, how shall I say, cautious, to say the least, because they are very secular societies. And on the other hand, on the one hand, they are secular societies, but on the other hand, you have thousands of Uzbeks, Kazakhs. I'm not quite sure about Turkmen, but certainly Kyrgyz and Tajik, but also a lot more Uyghurs from the Uyghur region of China have made their way to Syria. Now, under the HTS umbrella, all these fighters are there, and basically Turkey's policy protected them from Syrian, Russian, and Iranian attacks. And they finally took over in a surprise move, presumably supported by Turkey. So, for instance, the first question that comes to mind is who brought them, who took them from all these countries, who supported them to make that long trek into Syria to become a jihadist. in a country where they don't understand against whom they are doing jihad and for whom they are actually fighting. Okay, so um, basically, that I would think it's a long story, but but then all these factors may have contributed to that. But President Ersin Tatar came out with a practical argument. So the fact that they have opened embassies, or only Kazakhstan opened embassy though, the others have um, assigned their ambassadors in Italy to look after their supposed interests in southern Cyprus. So their ambassador would go to southern Cyprus once a year or so, to see if there is anything that concerns their country. So what Ersin Tatar has proposed is that um, because of this move, we should not get at each other's throat. And Turkey should would something like react very badly and overreact and um, perhaps even withdraw its embassies from these countries and asking them to leave Turkey, blah, blah. No. The relations should go on as if nothing happened. Behind the behind the curtain, there should be diplomatic, obviously, representations in a proper language. But at the same time, we should work to get these countries to also have some sort of diplomatic relations with Northern Cyprus. So they could easily say to the Greeks, well, we have embassies with you, but we have trade and diplomatic offices with them. So the Greeks would get even more angry and say, you can't have that. Azerbaijan is firmly on Turkey TRNC side. And as I said, many other countries. But this is a long saga, and it is going to go on like that. We've got to be patient, you know. And if you are dealing with Greeks, basically you have to learn to be patient because you can't get their agreement. I mean, the way they make arguments sometimes is such that I think that they are on something or they drink something that gives them the sense that they are, as if they are living on the moon or on another planet, or they expect some military reinforcements coming all the way from either Jupiter or Mars down to Eastern Mediterranean to push the Turks out of Cyprus. This is the sense. So I know all the drinks the Greeks drink, and all the drinks they make. Neither Zvania in Cyprus nor Chikudia in Crete, or Chipro in mainland Greece make this wine, but they are full of that.
Yeah. Well, thank you once again for that answer. I'm gonna have to ask one more question, and then we're gonna have to wrap up for the night. A lot of people in the Q&A are wanting to know about steps forward. We've spoken about Trump, and there's some angles there. We've spoken about how a federal solution is just simply not practical. But what are some practical steps the TRNC, Türkiye, Turkish Cypriots, what are some practical steps that they could take to navigate, international diplomacy and secure wider recognition?
Well, I think first of all, Turkey and TRNC should work for um, um, for larger representation everywhere in the world. Um, Now, for instance, I don't know and I don't understand why Turkey is not working with the Arab states for a better representation of TRNC. Like they could easily open um, trade offices independently of their embassies or what have you in the south, not as part of their embassy in the south. They can initiate direct flights, okay? And just a few, efforts, if you like, just a few moves would make Greek Cypriot claim for sovereignty over the island just laughable, okay? It is already laughable, but it would make it much more, how shall I say, disputable, laughable, and blah blah. And it would also it would also make them understand that they are not going to be able to extend their sovereign state sovereignty in the south to all the territories of Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. Okay? This is not going to happen. Cyprus is not going to be a Greek dominated state, just 40 miles off the Turkish southern coast. This is not going to happen. And the second thing is, um, I would think this, in the face of European Union propaganda and allure, although the European Union's allure is eroded over the years because there are movements in major countries that are likely to take over the administration that are completely against the European Union, in every sense. Um, so the people of Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus should not get carried away with that supposed allure of the European Union. Okay, um, um, and what can be done about that? There may be practical ways of doing it. There may be people. There are certainly people with practical ideas, both in the island and in Turkey, particularly in North Cyprus. I go quite often to Northern Cyprus to teach there, actually. So I'm one of the flying professors, who fly over to Northern Cyprus fortnightly or once a month and do some of my teachings online and some others face to face. So I'm quite familiar with the situation in North Cyprus, and uh, uh, sober-minded Greeks realize that you know Northern Cyprus is a different state, and it is developing in every sense. You come, for instance, from London or somewhere else, and you visit Northern Cyprus every 2 years, and every time you see a different Northern Cyprus with new, roads and infrastructure and tourist resorts, plus quite a flourishing economy, uh, as well as people, in terms of the economic development and in terms of the um, in terms of what you have per person, Northern Cyprus is not far ahead from Southern Cyprus. Southern Cyprus is an indebted state. Okay, they are indebted to their eyes. So, and they're going to have to pay that. But Northern Cyprus has no debt, even if it has to Turkey. Turkey always clears up the debt so what I'm saying is, there isn't much we need to do. We should perhaps just carry on the same line, but with new ideas about this and the other. And when there are opportunities arising out of each and every situation, we should focus on them too, to get as much as something to our favor. This is what I would say.
Perfect. Well, that's a great answer, Professor Anal, and you've been absolutely fantastic tonight, giving us a real insight into the wider geopolitical situation and how the Cyprus issue has come into it. So thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you to everyone that's watching online. Apologies, we can go through all of your questions. But yes, once again, thank you, Professor Ünal. I hope we keep in touch and we do some more work
Certainly.
together as the YTC. So thank
Well,
you, and thank you, everyone.
I thank you for the invitation, and please do keep in touch, and we should do more collaboration on a variety of things. Okay.
Definitely, definitely. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. Bye bye.
Bye.